Tonight we're stepping into a world where belief carried the weight of law, where fear and faith walked side by side through marble streets, and where the fate of an entire empire rested on the shoulders of a few carefully chosen children. Before we begin, if you enjoy slow, immersive history told like a story instead of a lecture, take a moment now to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel grow, and it lets me keep making long, quiet journeys like this one. And as you listen, feel free to share in the comments where you're watching from. Rome was vast, and history feels different depending on where you are. In ancient Rome, religion wasn't a private comfort or a Sunday habit. It was infrastructure. It was treated with the same seriousness as roads, armies, and laws. The Romans believed their city existed only because the gods allowed it to exist, and every victory, famine, fire, or illness was read as a message. If things went well, the gods were pleased. If something went wrong, someone had made a mistake, and Rome became obsessed with finding who. At the center of that anxiety stood the Vestal Virgins. They were not mystics wandering the countryside or philosophers debating the divine. They were practical, visible symbols of Rome's relationship with the gods. 6 priestesses at any given time, living beside the Roman Forum, tending a fire that was believed to be as old as the city itself. As long as that flame burned, Rome believed it was safe. As long as the Vestals remained pure, disciplined, and calm, the gods would keep the world from collapsing. This made them powerful. It also made them terrifying to be. Rome loved symbols more than explanations. The Vestals were not important because of what they personally believed or felt. They were important because they represented order. Their bodies symbolized stability. Their behavior symbolized control. Their silence symbolized obedience to forces greater than human emotion. If a Vestal stumbled in public, people whispered. If she looked tired during a ritual, senators panicked. If the sacred flame flickered, the city reacted as if the earth itself might split open. This wasn't superstition on the margins. This was state religion enforced by law, tradition, and fear. The Vestals lived in a magnificent complex known as the House of the Vestals, a marble residence with gardens, fountains, and elegant halls, located right next to the Temple of Vesta. It looked like privilege, felt like surveillance. Every step they took, every word they spoke, existed under the assumption that the gods were watching closely and that Rome would suffer if they failed. They enjoyed freedoms that other Roman women could not imagine. They could own property. They could write wills. They could move through the city without male guardians. They had reserved seating at games and ceremonies. Their testimony in court carried extraordinary weight. A condemned prisoner who accidentally touched a Vestal on the way to execution could be immediately pardoned. Rome trusted them that much. And yet, they lived with a kind of pressure that most people never experienced. Their value depended entirely on perfection. Not moral perfection in a modern sense, but ritual perfection. Correct posture, correct timing, correct silence, correct purity. The Vestals were not chosen because they wanted this life. They were chosen because Rome needed them. Selection happened when girls were very young, usually between 6 and 10 years old. The candidates had to come from respectable families, be physically healthy, mentally sharp, and free from anything Rome might interpret as a bad omen. No visible disabilities, no speech problems, no suspicious birth stories. Rome believed flaws attracted divine anger. When a girl was chosen, her family could not refuse. The ritual was called captio, which translates to seizure. The chief priest of Rome, the Pontifex Maximus, formally took the child from her household in a public ceremony. It was framed as an honor, but it was absolute. From that moment forward, the girl no longer belonged to her parents. She belonged to the state and to the goddess Vesta. Her hair was cut and buried as a symbol of leaving her old life behind. She was dressed in white robes and veiled. She was led into the temple complex and taught, gently at first, that her body, her time, and her future were no longer her own. For the next 30 years, her life followed a strict structure. 10 years of training, 10 years of full service, 10 years of teaching others. This was not symbolic. It was enforced with discipline, ritual correction, and in rare cases, punishment that could end in death. What kept the system running was fear disguised as reverence. Rome did not trust chance. If floods came, someone was at fault. If enemies won a battle, someone had failed the gods. The Vestals existed so Rome could believe disasters were preventable, controllable, and punishable. They were not Rome's comfort. They were Rome's reassurance that chaos could be managed. The moment a girl was taken into the service of Vesta, her life narrowed into something very small and very exact. Rome did not ease children into sacred duty. It reshaped them quickly, before memory could interfere. Once the ritual seizure was complete, the child was led away from familiar streets, familiar voices, familiar arms, and brought into a space where nothing belonged to her anymore, not even time. The house of the Vestals was beautiful in a way meant to impress gods and humans equally. Smooth marble floors cooled the feet. Columns rose high and orderly, as if reminding everyone inside that structure was sacred. Fountains murmured softly in courtyards planted with flowers and carefully trimmed trees. From the outside, it looked like privilege. From the inside, it felt like permanence. This was where she would live for the next 30 years. The separation from family was total. No scheduled visits, no holidays, no returning home when she felt sick or afraid. Rome believed sacred roles worked best when attachments were severed cleanly. Emotional ties were considered distractions. The goddess came first. The state came second. Everything else vanished. For a child, this meant learning silence before understanding it. Older Vestals spoke gently, but firmly. They corrected posture. They adjusted veils. They reminded the girls to move slowly, to speak clearly, to keep their eyes calm and forward. Emotion was not forbidden, but expression was. A Vestal was meant to appear steady even when she felt lost. The first decade was devoted almost entirely to training. 10 years of learning how to exist correctly. Rituals in Rome were unforgiving. A single word spoken incorrectly could invalidate an entire ceremony. A movement performed out of sequence could offend a god. The novice Vestals memorized chants whose meanings mattered less than their exact sound. They practiced carrying vessels of water without spilling a drop. They learned which days were sacred, which gestures were pure, and which mistakes required immediate correction. They also learned why fear mattered. Rome taught through examples. Stories were told quietly about Vestals who had failed. Flames that had gone out. Omens misread. Punishments carried out not because someone was evil, but because the city could not afford uncertainty. These stories were not meant to terrify, but they did. They taught the girls that perfection was not optional. It was protective. At the center of everything stood the sacred flame. Before a Vestal was trusted to tend it, she observed. She watched older priestesses work in careful shifts, feeding the fire with prepared wood, clearing ash with ritual tools, never rushing, never hesitating. The flame burned in the Temple of Vesta, an open, circular structure designed to resemble an ancient hearth. This was no accident. Rome believed the city itself was a household, and Vesta was its guardian. The fire could not be lit casually. It was rekindled only through prescribed methods, sometimes using sunlight concentrated through polished surfaces. It was never allowed to go out completely. If it did, Rome believed its protection failed instantly. When novices were finally allowed to assist, hands shook. Everyone noticed. Mistakes were corrected without drama but never without memory. A Vestal learned quickly that attention was survival. Despite the tension, life inside the house followed a steady rhythm. Meals were shared. Duties rotated. Older Vestals acted as teachers and guardians, sometimes stern, sometimes quietly protective. They had lived long enough to understand the system from the inside. They knew when to warn and when to reassure. Education extended beyond religion. Vestals learned to read and write fluently, an uncommon privilege for Roman women. They learned law, record-keeping, and the handling of important documents, because Rome trusted them with wills, treaties, and state records. Their training made them useful, not ornamental. Still, the outside world never fully disappeared. The sounds of the forum drifted over the walls. Crowds cheering, arguments rising, processions passing close enough to hear footsteps. The girls could see Rome but not touch it. They grew up knowing the city depended on them, yet lived just apart from it. As the years passed, training shifted subtly into responsibility. Novices became assistants. Assistants became Vestals in full service. The fear did not disappear. It matured. By the end of the first decade, a Vestal understood exactly how fragile her position was. She also understood her power. By the time a Vestal entered her second decade, Rome no longer saw her as a child in training. She was now a full guardian of the city's spiritual balance. This was the period when everything became public, visible, and unforgiving. The training years happened behind walls. Full service happened in front of the entire city. Each day began before most of Rome stirred. The Vestals moved through the Temple of Vesta with practiced calm, their white garments clean, their veils arranged just so. The sacred flame demanded attention constantly. Ash had to be cleared with ritual tools. Firewood had to be selected carefully, dried correctly, and placed with intention. Nothing about the process was casual. Even breathing too close to the hearth at the wrong moment was discouraged. Rome believed the flame was alive in a symbolic sense. It represented continuity. As long as it burned, Rome was still Rome. When foreign armies threatened the borders or political violence shook the city, people glanced toward the temple, reassured simply by smoke rising into the air. This meant that the Vestals worked under permanent pressure. They rotated shifts so the fire was never unattended. Fatigue was not an excuse. Illness was managed quietly. Fear was hidden. If the flame dimmed or went out, even accidentally, the responsibility fell on whoever had been closest to it. Punishment followed ritual logic, not emotional fairness. The Vestal responsible could be beaten in private by the Pontifex Maximus, not as cruelty, but as purification. Rome believed pain corrected imbalance. At the same time, the city launched emergency rituals. Animals were sacrificed. Prayers were shouted. Omens were reinterpreted. Everyone wanted reassurance that the gods were listening again. The Vestals did far more than guard fire. They prepared sacred substances used across Roman religion, including salted flour sprinkled during sacrifices. They oversaw purification ceremonies after crimes, disasters, or military defeats. They safeguarded objects Rome considered too important to trust to anyone else. Treaties, wills, and political documents were stored under their care because harming a Vestal was unthinkable. Public appearances mattered just as much as private rituals. Vestals attended festivals, state ceremonies, and major sacrifices. They sat in places of honor, visible reminders that Rome was still under divine protection. When they entered an arena or forum, crowds noticed. People lowered their voices. Senators adjusted their posture. Their presence had legal force. If a Vestal encountered a condemned prisoner on the way to execution and touched him, even by accident, the sentence was immediately void. The man was freed. Rome believed the goddess worked through her priestesses directly. This made Vestals powerful in ways no other woman could be. But visibility brought danger. Every movement was interpreted. A stumble could become an omen. Pale face could inspire rumors. Rome's fear needed targets, and Vestals stood at the center of its imagination. When crops failed or storms damaged the city, whispers followed. Someone must have failed the gods. Someone must be punished to restore balance. The Vestals were also bound by absolute chastity. This was not framed as personal morality but as structural necessity. Rome believed a Vestal's sexual purity was directly tied to the city's survival. One broken vow, even rumored, threatened everything. They learned to manage distance carefully. Conversations stayed public. Eye contact was brief. Smiles were measured. A Vestal could walk freely through Rome, but freedom under scrutiny is not freedom at all. During these years, many Vestals developed an internal stillness. They learned how to appear calm even when anxiety tightened their chest. They learned how to become symbols without losing themselves completely. Some succeeded. Some struggled quietly. This decade defined them. They were no longer children taken by the state, and not yet elders guiding others. They were the living boundary between order and chaos. Of all the rules that shaped a Vestal's life, none carried more weight than the vow of chastity. Rome treated this vow not as a personal promise, but as a structural pillar holding the city upright. To the Roman mind, a Vestal's body was not her own. It was a living symbol of purity, and that purity was believed to be directly connected to Rome's safety, its harvests, its victories, and its survival. The logic was simple even if it was cruel. Vesta was the goddess of the hearth, the home, the inner fire that kept families and cities alive. Her priestesses embodied that fire. If a Vestal remained untouched, the flame remained stable. If her vow was broken, Rome believed disorder would seep into everything, into politics, weather, war, and disease. It didn't matter whether this made sense. It mattered that people believed it. Because of this, Vestals lived under constant observation. They could move through the city freely, but freedom under suspicion is a narrow thing. Private conversation could raise eyebrows. Standing too close to someone in public could spark whispers. A smile held a moment too long might become evidence in someone else's story. Roman men faced no equivalent standard. Their private lives were irrelevant. The Vestal's private life, real or imagined, was everyone's concern. Accusations did not need proof. They needed timing. Rome was deeply uncomfortable with randomness. When disaster struck, the city searched for meaning. A failed military campaign, a strange eclipse, an outbreak of illness, or a run of bad harvests all demanded explanation. Often, that explanation took the form of a Vestal accused of impurity. The city could not punish fate, but it could punish a woman. When suspicion arose, the process moved quickly. The Pontifex Maximus presided over the investigation. The Vestal was questioned, not to uncover truth as we understand it, but to satisfy ritual requirements. Her words mattered less than the mood of the city. If Rome felt unlucky, someone had to be responsible. If guilt was declared, the punishment was unlike anything else in Roman law. A Vestal could not be executed in the usual way. She was sacred. Killing her outright would offend the goddess. So Rome created a solution that satisfied both cruelty and ritual purity. She was buried alive. The execution was carefully staged. The Vestal was placed in a covered litter so no one could see her face. She was led outside the city to an underground chamber prepared in advance. Inside there was a bed, a lamp, a small amount of food and water. Rome insisted this proved mercy. Officially, the state did not kill her. It simply sealed her away and allowed fate to finish the work. The chamber was closed. Earth was piled on top. The crowd watched in silence. The man involved, if there was one, was executed publicly, usually whipped to death. His role mattered less to history. Rome's fear centered on the Vestal because she represented order itself. Her punishment was meant to reassure the city that balance had been restored. Not every accusation ended this way, but the possibility haunted every Vestal. Even those who lived perfectly could be undone by politics, superstition, or bad timing. Some were condemned during periods of intense anxiety, when Rome needed a scapegoat more than it needed truth. This created a strange paradox. Vestals were honored, respected, and granted immense privilege, yet they lived closer to death than most citizens. They were elevated so high that a single fall destroyed them completely. Over time, senior Vestals learned how to navigate this danger. They avoided attention when possible. They cultivated restraint. They understood that survival depended not only on obedience, but on appearing exactly as Rome expected them to appear. The vow of chastity was never just about sex. It was about control, fear, and the belief that a woman's body could carry the moral weight of an empire. The Vestals carried that belief every day, quietly, publicly, and without escape. As the years passed and a Vestal moved beyond the most dangerous midpoint of her service, something subtle but important began to change. She was no longer only watched. She was also listened to. By the third decade of service, a Vestal had survived training, public scrutiny, constant pressure, and the quiet terror of accusation. Survival itself became a kind of authority. Rome valued endurance. Anyone who lasted long enough inside a rigid system earned respect, not because they were kind or wise, but because they had proven they could exist without breaking. Senior Vestals embodied that ideal. They were steady where others trembled. They moved slowly, spoke carefully, and rarely needed to raise their voices. When they did speak, people paid attention. This final decade was devoted to teaching and oversight. Younger Vestals watched them closely, copying gestures, tone, and posture. Instruction was rarely dramatic. Correction came in small movements, a hand adjusting a veil, a quiet reminder whispered during ritual. A look that said enough had already been said. Authority inside the house of the Vestals was subtle, built on experience rather than force. Senior Vestals managed the daily rhythm of sacred life. They organized shifts, ensured supplies were prepared correctly, and decided who was ready for which responsibilities. They handled disputes quietly, knowing that open conflict inside the order would worry the city outside its walls. Stability was always the goal. Their influence extended beyond the temple. Politicians sought their favor carefully, never directly asking for help, but hoping for proximity. A Vestal's presence at a ceremony could legitimize a political moment. Her silence could cast doubt. Rome pretended religion and politics were separate, but everyone understood how deeply they were entwined. Some senior Vestals became confidants to powerful men, not romantically but strategically. They heard things others did not. They saw patterns in Rome's fears. They learned when tension was rising and when scapegoats might soon be needed. This knowledge helped them protect the younger priestesses when possible, guiding them away from dangerous visibility or unwanted attention. After 30 years of service, a Vestal was finally released from her vows. In theory, she was free to leave the order, return to civilian life, and even marry. Rome spoke of this as a reward. In practice, it was complicated. By that point, most Vestals were in their late 30s or early 40s. They had lived their entire adult lives inside a sacred system, structured down to the smallest gesture. The outside world felt loud, unpredictable, and strangely small. Marriage was an option, but many declined it. Roman men were often intimidated by former Vestals, whose legal independence and social status disrupted traditional power dynamics. Those who did marry were watched closely. People wondered whether their presence still carried divine weight, or whether their purity had been permanently altered by release. Rome never quite decided. Many Vestals chose to remain connected to the order, living nearby, advising younger priestesses, and maintaining a role within the religious structure they understood so well. It was the only life they had truly known. Their legacy was complicated. Rome praised them in public while fearing them in private. They were honored, yet never fully trusted. Powerful, yet always vulnerable to rumor. Their existence reveals something deeply human about Rome. The city needed certainty so badly that it placed impossible expectations on a few women and called it divine order. The Vestal order did not remain frozen in time. Rome itself was never still, and the role of its most sacred priestesses shifted as the city grew, fractured, and reinvented itself again and again. What stayed constant was the belief that the Vestals reflected Rome's health. What changed was how desperately Rome needed them. In the early centuries, when Rome was still defining itself, the Vestals felt close to the hearth, close to the mythic past. Their rituals were simple, their authority grounded in tradition rather than spectacle. But as Rome expanded into an empire, everything grew louder. Politics became sharper, power concentrated, anxiety increased. The Vestals were pulled deeper into the public eye because Rome needed visible reassurance more than ever. Wars stretched across continents. Generals gained enormous influence. Civil unrest simmered beneath daily life. In moments like these, Romans looked for signs that the gods had not abandoned them. The Temple of Vesta became a focal point for that hope. As long as the flame burned, the empire felt anchored. This placed additional pressure on the Vestals themselves. They were expected to embody calm while Rome burned figuratively and sometimes literally around them. When fires swept through neighborhoods, people whispered nervously about omens. When political violence erupted in the streets, eyes turned toward the temple. The Vestals did not comment. They simply performed their duties with precision, reinforcing the illusion that order still existed. Over time, their legal and symbolic power grew. Emperors publicly honored them, knowing that association with the Vestals projected legitimacy. Some rulers restored or expanded the house of the Vestals after disasters, framing it as an act of devotion while quietly strengthening their own image. The Vestals became useful not just to the gods but to propaganda. Yet with visibility came risk. The more Rome depended on symbols, the more dangerous it became to embody one. During periods of extreme unrest, accusations against Vestals increased. History records clusters of trials during times of famine, invasion, or political transition. Fear sharpened suspicion. Rome's need for reassurance sometimes demanded sacrifice. Internally, the Vestals adapted. They refined their discipline. They became even more cautious about public behavior. Senior Vestals developed an acute sense of timing, knowing when to appear and when to withdraw. Their survival depended on reading the city's mood as carefully as they read ritual texts. As centuries passed, religious life in Rome slowly began to change. New gods were introduced. Foreign cults gained popularity. Personal devotion started to compete with traditional state religion. The Vestals remained respected, but they no longer stood alone at the center of Roman belief. This created quiet tension. The sacred flame still burned, but fewer people understood why it mattered. Then came the most profound shift of all. Christianity began spreading through the empire, first quietly, then boldly. It offered a different relationship with the divine, one that emphasized personal belief over ritual perfection. For a long time, Rome tried to accommodate both systems. Vestals continued their duties while churches appeared in distant corners of the city. Eventually, coexistence became impossible. As emperors converted and laws changed, state support for traditional Roman religion weakened. The Vestals found themselves guarding a flame that fewer people feared and fewer still revered. Their authority faded not through violence, but through indifference. The final Vestals performed their rituals with the same care as their predecessors, even as the world around them moved on. When the sacred fire was finally extinguished, it was not by accident or accusation, but by decree. The state no longer needed the symbol. Rome did not collapse that day, but something ancient ended quietly. The story of the Vestal Virgins lingers because it exposes something uncomfortable about how power works when fear becomes law. Rome told itself that the Vestals were honored, protected, and elevated. In many ways, that was true, but honor did not equal safety, and protection did not equal freedom. The Vestals lived inside a system that praised them loudly while controlling them completely. Rome's obsession with order shaped everything about their lives. The city believed chaos was always waiting just beneath the surface. Crops might fail. Enemies might invade. The gods might turn away without warning. To prevent this, Rome created rituals, rules, and symbols so strict that uncertainty itself became a crime. The Vestals were the most important of those symbols. What made their position unique was the way gender and power intersected. Roman society was deeply patriarchal. Women were expected to exist within households under male authority, their value tied to family and marriage. Vestals broke that pattern, but only by stepping completely outside normal womanhood. They gained independence by surrendering their bodies to the state. Freedom was granted only after total control. This contradiction was never resolved. Vestals could walk unguarded through the city, yet they were never alone. They could speak in court, yet their own voices mattered little during accusation. They were celebrated as pure, yet punished brutally if that purity was questioned. Rome could not imagine female authority without isolation, surveillance, and fear. The system relied on public belief. As long as people believed the Vestals protected Rome, the illusion held. But belief is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement. That's why Vestals were visible at festivals, sacrifices, and state events. Seeing them reassured the crowd that the ancient order still functioned. At the same time, visibility made them targets. When Rome felt strong, Vestals were admired. When Rome felt threatened, they were scrutinized. This pattern appears again and again in Roman history. During stable periods, accusations were rare. During crises, trials increased. The Vestals became mirrors reflecting the city's anxiety back at itself. This reveals a deeper truth. The Vestals were not punished because they were dangerous. They were punished because Rome needed someone it could control completely. Their existence allowed the state to pretend that disaster had clear causes and clean solutions. Blame a priestess, perform a ritual, restore order. Even the famous burial alive punishment followed this logic. It avoided bloodshed, preserved ritual purity, and created the illusion that Rome did not commit murder. In reality, it was one of the most severe executions imaginable, carried out not in anger, but in silence. That silence mattered. It told the city that fear had been contained. When Christianity eventually replaced the old gods, the Vestals disappeared, but the pattern did not. Societies still create symbols to absorb fear. They still place impossible expectations on certain groups. They still confuse control with stability. The Vestals feel ancient, but the logic that shaped them is familiar. This is why their story remains unsettling. It forces us to confront how easily reverence turns into pressure, and how quickly protection becomes possession. The Vestals were not villains, and they were rarely heroes. They were functionaries inside a belief system that valued certainty over humanity. As you listen, think about how many modern systems still rely on invisible labor, quiet endurance, and the expectation that someone else will carry the risk so the rest of society can feel safe. If this story is making you reflect, let me know in the comments what part has stayed with you the most so far. Reading your thoughts helps shape future stories. An ordinary day for a Vestal did not begin with drama or ceremony. It began with routine because routine was the spine of sacred life. Long before the city fully woke, before shopkeepers lifted shutters or senators gathered their robes, the house of the Vestals was already stirring. The air inside was cool and still, carrying faint traces of smoke and ash from the night watch. A Vestal rose quietly from her bed, washed, and dressed with practiced movements. The white robe was arranged carefully, not for beauty, but for correctness. The veil was placed to sit just right, neither slipping nor constricting. These details mattered because the gods were believed to notice details. Carelessness was a form of disrespect. The first responsibility was always the flame. Whoever was assigned to the early watch moved into the Temple of Vesta with deliberate calm. The fire was checked, fed, and observed, not stared at, not fussed over, but attended like a living thing that needed steady care rather than emotion. Ash was cleared using ritual tools that were never used for anything else. Wood was added slowly. No sudden movements, no unnecessary sound. For a moment there was quiet, not silence, but a kind of held breath. This was the heart of the city, and for a brief stretch of time, it belonged only to a few women and an ancient belief. Afterward came preparation for the day's rituals. Sacred substances had to be made fresh, following exact instructions passed down for generations. Measurements were memorized, not written down, because knowledge was meant to live inside the body. Mistakes were rare, not because Vestals were flawless, but because repetition had carved the process into muscle memory. Meals were simple and shared. Conversations stayed light, practical, and restrained. No one spoke loudly. No one complained openly. A Vestal learned early that words lingered longer than silence. What was said inside the house could echo beyond its walls. As the day unfolded, duties shifted. Some Vestals prepared for public appearances, adjusting garments and reviewing the sequence of events they would attend. Others worked inside the house, maintaining records, checking stored documents, or teaching novices. Instruction was constant. Even experienced Vestals were always learning, refining, adjusting. The younger girls watched everything. They learned not only rituals, but how to exist under observation. How to stand when someone important entered the room. How to lower their eyes without appearing ashamed. How to move through a crowd without drawing attention, yet still command respect. These lessons were never written down. They were absorbed. Outside the walls, Rome roared. Arguments flared in the forum. Animals were driven toward sacrifice. Messengers hurried past with news from distant borders. Inside the house of the Vestals, that noise was softened, filtered, kept at a distance. The contrast was intentional. The Vestals were meant to appear untouched by chaos, even when chaos pressed close. Public duties broke the rhythm. When Vestals left the house, the city noticed. People stepped aside. Conversations dipped. Some watched with reverence, others with curiosity, a few with resentment. The Vestals did not respond. Their power lay in restraint. There were moments of quiet humanity, though few people wrote about them. A shared glance between senior Vestals when a ritual went smoothly. A novice's relief after completing a task without correction. A fleeting sense of pride when the flame burned strong during a troubled time for the city. Fear was always present, but it became background noise, like the hum of the city itself. Vestals did not wake each day thinking about punishment. They woke thinking about precision. Fear only surfaced when something went wrong, or when Rome itself seemed restless. As evening approached, responsibilities passed to the next shift. The flame was checked again. The house settled. Some Vestals read quietly. Others rested. The city's noise dimmed, replaced by distant footsteps and fading voices. Another day ended without disaster, and that alone felt like success. This was the reality behind the marble and myth. Not constant terror, not constant honor, just unbroken attention, day after day, year after year, in service of an idea larger than any single life. Routine only held as long as Rome believed the gods were satisfied. When something unusual happened, routine cracked instantly. An unexpected storm, a strange birth, a military defeat. Even an animal behaving oddly could ripple through the city like a warning bell. Romans called these signs prodigies, messages from the divine that demanded immediate attention. And when prodigies appeared, the Vestals were pulled to the center of the response. Omens disrupted everything. A report might arrive at dawn that lightning had struck a temple roof, or a farmer might claim a statue had wept. The Senate would convene in tension, not to debate policy, but to interpret meaning. What had Rome done wrong? Which god was displeased? And most importantly, how to fix it before consequences escalated. The Vestals were summoned because they were believed to stand closest to the god's will. They prepared purification rites, adjusted rituals, and sometimes fasted or increased their duties to demonstrate renewed devotion. These actions were symbolic, but symbols mattered more than explanations. Rome needed to see something being done. If the sacred flame flickered or behaved strangely, anxiety surged. A weak flame suggested neglect. An unusually strong one could be read as anger. The Vestals responded carefully, neither panicking nor dismissing concern. They knew their reactions mattered as much as the ritual itself. Calm suggested control. Hesitation suggested danger. Sometimes the signs pointed inward. During prolonged crises, suspicion fell not on foreign enemies or bad luck, but on ritual failure. Someone inside Rome must have erred. Vestals understood this pattern well. They watched the city's mood closely, sensing when fear was turning into blame. Senior Vestals became especially vigilant, tightening discipline, reducing public exposure, and emphasizing flawless performance. Investigations could begin quietly. Questions were asked. Behavior was reviewed. Past incidents were re-examined. Even innocent deviations took on new meaning when framed by fear. A Vestal who had once seemed merely distracted could now appear careless. Rome did not look for patterns of kindness. It looked for cracks. Not every omen led to accusation, but every accusation began with an omen. What made these moments especially dangerous was that logic gave way to symbolism. Evidence mattered less than restoration of confidence. If condemning a Vestal would reassure the population, that option hovered silently in the background, even if no one wanted to say it aloud. The Vestals responded by leaning into restraint. They avoided gatherings when possible. They spoke less. They performed more. Their goal was not to defend themselves, but to remove themselves as targets. It worked sometimes. Other times, nothing worked at all. The city's reaction to fear followed familiar steps. First came interpretation, then ritual, then, if anxiety persisted, punishment. This sequence allowed Rome to believe it was regaining control. The Vestals were woven into every stage, whether they wished to be or not. Yet there was another side to these moments. Omens also reinforced the Vestals' authority. When a crisis passed after rituals were performed, people credited the priestesses. Relief turned into gratitude. Confidence returned. For a while, at least, these cycles repeated across centuries. Calm, sign, fear, action, resolution. Through it all, the Vestals remained steady, absorbing the emotional shock of an empire that could never fully relax. As you listen, notice how familiar this rhythm feels. Even today, societies search for meaning in disruption and demand visible responses to uncertainty. Rome's language was divine, but its instincts were human. Long after the last Vestal had left the temple and the sacred flame had gone cold, stories about them continued to circulate. But these stories did not belong to the women themselves. They belonged to historians, poets, moralists, and later writers who used the Vestals as symbols rather than people. What survived was not their voices, but interpretations layered on top of silence. Roman historians wrote about Vestals selectively. They focused on moments of scandal, punishment, or divine intervention, because those moments served larger narratives about morality and state order. A Vestal who lived 30 quiet years and retired without incident rarely earned more than a passing mention. A Vestal accused of breaking her vow became unforgettable. Drama preserved memory. Stability did not. This shaped how later generations understood them. The Vestals were often presented as moral lessons rather than human beings. To some writers, they were proof that discipline preserved civilization. To others, they were warnings about female independence or divine wrath. Their inner lives, their doubts, their small daily choices vanished between the lines. As Rome transitioned into a Christian empire, attitudes hardened. Pagan priestesses no longer fit the new moral framework. Christian writers sometimes portrayed Vestals as relics of superstition, their rituals empty, their authority misplaced. At the same time, a strange admiration lingered. Their chastity, discipline, and endurance resembled virtues Christianity valued, even if the theology was rejected. This created a distorted mirror. Vestals were criticized and praised at once, but rarely understood on their own terms. Their celibacy was admired, but their power was questioned. Their devotion was respected, but their gods were dismissed. They became transitional figures used to explain what Rome had been and what it was becoming. Archaeology added another layer. Ruins of the House of the Vestals revealed elegance, space, and careful design. Statues showed calm faces, controlled posture, idealized serenity. These images reinforced the myth of composure, making it harder to imagine fear, exhaustion, or quiet resistance. Stone does not record anxiety. Modern historians approach the Vestals differently. Instead of asking whether they were holy or corrupt, scholars ask what function they served, how fear shaped their role, how gender defined their boundaries, how power operated through ritual rather than force. This shift brings the Vestals closer, but still not fully into view. We know almost nothing about what they wrote privately, because private writing was not preserved. We do not know how many wished they had been chosen, and how many resented it. We do not know how they grieved family deaths from afar, or how they processed accusations against sisters in the order. History records structure. Emotion slips through. What remains clear is that the Vestals were not anomalies. They were products of a society that believed survival depended on visible order and controlled bodies. They existed because Rome could not tolerate uncertainty. Their endurance tells us less about divine favor and more about human systems that demand sacrifice to feel stable. The way they were remembered says as much about later societies as it does about Rome. Each era reshaped the Vestals to fit its fears and ideals. They became symbols of purity, cautionary tales, curiosities, and eventually footnotes. Rarely were they allowed to simply be women navigating an impossible role. As this story continues, we'll move closer to that missing human space. We'll look at moments where Vestals pushed against expectations, where small choices hinted at agency inside constraint, and where the system bent even slightly. If this perspective is changing how you think about ancient history, consider staying with the series. Subscribing helps keep long, thoughtful stories like this alive. And if you have thoughts about how history chooses what to remember, share them in the comments. There were moments, rarely recorded but quietly present, when Vestals pushed against the edges of their role. Not in open rebellion, which would have been impossible, but in subtle decisions that revealed they were more than passive symbols. Agency for a Vestal did not look like defiance. It looked like timing, restraint, and choosing when to follow the letter of the rule and when to lean into its spirit. One way this appeared was through mercy. Because a Vestal's presence could halt an execution, some learned to position themselves carefully during public processions. Officially, this was coincidence. Unofficially, it allowed them to intervene without appearing to challenge the law. Ancient writers mention these moments briefly, but the fact that they happened at all suggests awareness and intent. A single step taken at the right moment could change a life. Inside the house of the Vestals, senior priestesses sometimes shielded younger ones. When a novice struggled or made a minor mistake, correction could be handled quietly rather than reported upward. This was risky. Concealment itself could be interpreted as ritual failure. Yet experienced Vestals understood that perfection was an illusion, and survival required judgment. They chose when strictness served the goddess and when it served fear instead. These small acts mattered because the system allowed almost no room for humanity. By bending without breaking, Vestals preserved both the order and the people inside it. Their power was not loud. It was careful. Friendship also existed, though Rome rarely acknowledged it. Living together for decades created bonds stronger than most Roman women experienced. Vestals relied on one another emotionally, even if affection had to remain understated. A glance, a shared task, or quiet companionship during long watches of the flame carried meaning. These connections helped them endure isolation from family and the constant weight of expectation. Some Vestals became known for particular strengths. One might be especially skilled at calming public anxiety. Another might excel at teaching novices. Another might handle political tension with remarkable composure. These reputations were never official titles, but they shaped internal dynamics. Authority did not always align with seniority. Respect grew organically. Occasionally, Vestals challenged male authority indirectly. They did not argue openly with senators or priests, but they could delay, redirect, or quietly insist on ritual correctness in ways that stalled political agendas. Because religion underpinned law, these moments carried weight. A ceremony postponed could disrupt plans. A ritual declared improperly timed could force reconsideration. These were small levers, but they existed. Even the decision to leave or stay after 30 years could be an assertion of self. Some Vestals chose marriage, stepping into a radically different life despite scrutiny. Others chose to remain connected to the order, valuing familiarity over uncertainty. Both choices carried consequences, and making either required courage in a society that preferred clear categories. These moments do not turn Vestals into modern heroes. They lived within constraints we would find suffocating. But they remind us that systems never operate as cleanly as they claim. Even the most controlled roles contain spaces where individuals interpret, adapt, and endure in their own ways. Rome was not the only ancient society to give women sacred roles, but it was unusual in how narrowly and permanently it defined them. Across the ancient world, priestesses existed in many forms. In Greece, women served goddesses like Athena and Artemis, often temporarily, often alongside ordinary family life. In Egypt, priestesses could marry, own property, and moved between sacred and secular roles. In Mesopotamia, some women held religious authority tied to temples and land, not lifelong isolation. What made the Vestals different was how completely Rome bound their bodies to the survival of the state. Other cultures treated priesthood as a role. Rome treated it as a condition. A Vestal did not step in and out of sacred life. She was absorbed into it. The length of service alone was extraordinary. 30 years was longer than many Roman marriages lasted, longer than some political careers, longer than most people's sense of stability. It ensured that Vestals matured, aged, and formed their identity almost entirely inside the institution. This permanence created trust, but it also created dependence. Rome trusted the Vestals because they had no competing loyalties. No husband, no children, no household to pull them elsewhere. The state replaced family, and the goddess replaced personal future. This arrangement felt safe to Roman leaders because it removed unpredictability. Gender shaped every part of this structure. Rome could not imagine granting similar authority to married women, whose loyalties were divided, or to men, whose sexuality was considered uncontrollable rather than dangerous. The Vestals occupied a narrow category that existed only because it was tightly managed. Even their purity was defined differently from other cultures. In some religions, sexual activity was not a threat to sacred power. In Rome, it was the threat. This reflected Roman anxiety more than divine command. Control over reproduction, inheritance, and lineage mattered deeply in Roman society. A sexually autonomous woman represented uncertainty. Vestals eliminated that uncertainty by being removed from the system entirely. This helps explain why the Vestal order lasted so long. It fit Rome's deepest instincts, transformed fear into structure. It offered a visible answer to invisible dangers. Other priesthoods faded as beliefs shifted. The Vestals endured because they were useful beyond theology. As Rome expanded, conquered, and absorbed foreign ideas, the Vestals remained unchanged in their essentials. This rigidity made them seem ancient even to Romans themselves. They were living reminders of a past when the city was smaller and belief felt simpler. In times of confusion, Rome clung to that image. But rigidity has limits. When belief systems evolve, institutions that cannot adapt become fragile. The Vestals survived political upheaval, civil war, and empire-wide transformation, but they could not survive a world that no longer needed their logic. When divine favor was no longer measured by ritual precision, their purpose quietly dissolved. Yet their story endures because it reveals how societies manage fear through bodies, symbols, and sacrifice. The Vestals were not anomalies. They were extreme expressions of a common impulse. When uncertainty feels unbearable, control becomes sacred. For most ordinary Romans, the Vestals were not abstract symbols or historical institutions. They were real women seen in real moments, moving through the city's crowded streets, appearing at festivals, standing silently during sacrifices, or passing by during times of fear. The way people felt about them was layered, personal, and often contradictory. To many, seeing a Vestal was reassuring. Her presence suggested stability, a reminder that despite political chaos or personal hardship, the ancient rhythm still held. When people caught sight of white robes and veils in the distance, they felt the quiet comfort of continuity. The flame was still burning. Rome was still standing. Children were taught to step aside respectfully. Adults lowered their voices instinctively. Even hardened soldiers and ambitious politicians treated Vestals with a kind of careful distance. It wasn't affection exactly. It was awe mixed with unease. The Vestals represented forces no one wanted to provoke. At public festivals, the reaction could feel almost intimate. Crowds pressed close, eager to glimpse them. Some whispered prayers under their breath as Vestals passed, hoping proximity might bring luck. Others watched with suspicion, scanning posture and expression, unconsciously judging whether these women looked worthy of their burden. In times of crisis, emotions sharpened. During famines, epidemics, or military disasters, people looked to the Vestals not for answers, but for reassurance. If the Vestals appeared calm, hope lingered. If they looked strained or withdrawn, fear spread quickly. Ordinary Romans read meaning into every detail because meaning felt safer than randomness. There was also resentment. Some Romans, especially women, noticed the contradictions. Vestals lived comfortably while others struggled. They had legal rights denied to wives and daughters. They moved freely while most women remained confined to households. This bred quiet bitterness, even if it was rarely voiced aloud. Respect did not erase envy. Men too felt conflicted. Vestals disrupted familiar power structures. They could not be commanded, married, or dismissed easily. Their authority came from belief, not force, and that made it harder to challenge. Some admired this. Others resented it deeply. Rumors thrived in this emotional space. A Vestal seen laughing might be accused of frivolity. One seen grieving might be suspected of weakness. The city projected its own anxieties onto them. The Vestals became screens onto which people cast hopes, fears, and frustrations. Despite this, many Vestals developed a quiet rapport with the public. They learned how to carry themselves in ways that soothed rather than provoked. Calm movements, neutral expressions, measured distance. This emotional labor was never acknowledged, but it mattered. It helped Rome feel held together. These everyday encounters reveal something essential. The Vestals were not distant idols. They were part of daily urban life, woven into the emotional fabric of the city. People reacted to them not only as priestesses, but as living signs that someone was still paying attention to the gods. Most Vestals passed through history without names, remembered only as part of an institution. But a few broke through anonymity, not because they sought attention, but because Rome needed stories. These individual Vestals became symbols layered on top of symbols, their lives reduced to moments that fit larger narratives about virtue, failure, and divine will. When a Vestal was praised publicly, it was rarely for who she was. It was for what she represented. Ancient writers recorded stories of Vestals who showed extraordinary composure during disasters, who maintained rituals during invasions, or who intervened at exactly the right moment to spare a condemned life. These accounts framed them as proof that the system worked. Rome loved examples that reinforced belief. One famous story tells of a Vestal accused falsely of breaking her vow. According to the tale, she proved her innocence by performing a miracle, carrying water in a sieve without spilling a drop. The point of the story was not the woman's fear or courage. It was reassurance. The gods would protect true purity. Rome could trust the system after all. Other stories were darker. Vestals accused during times of crisis were remembered as warnings. Their names became attached to disaster, even if evidence was thin or non-existent. Later writers repeated these accounts without questioning motives or context. Once blame entered the historical record, it hardened into truth. Fame was never gentle. A Vestal known by name was exposed long after death. Her life became a lesson taught to others, stripped of nuance. Was she truly guilty? Was she sacrificed to calm the city? History rarely pauses to ask. What stands out is how uneven memory was. Male politicians who caused wars could be forgiven or reinterpreted. Vestals accused of ritual failure were frozen in moral judgment. Their stories remained cautionary because Rome feared what they symbolized going wrong. Some Vestals gained quiet respect without scandal. They were known within the order as stabilizing figures, trusted advisors, or calm presences during volatile times. But because their lives lacked dramatic rupture, they faded from the written record. History prefers conflict. This selective memory reveals something important. Rome did not remember Vestals as people. It remembered them as emotional tools. Praise restored confidence. Condemnation restored control. Memory itself became part of the system. For the Vestals living through this, awareness mattered. They knew that a single moment could define how they would be remembered, if they were remembered at all. This knowledge shaped behavior even more tightly than law. Survival meant not just living correctly, but leaving no story behind. As we move forward, the focus shifts again. In the next part, we'll look at how the physical spaces of the Vestals shaped their lives, how architecture reinforced belief, and how stone, layout, and location quietly controlled behavior every day. The spaces the Vestals lived and worked in were not neutral backdrops. They were carefully designed to shape behavior, reinforce belief, and quietly remind everyone inside them of their role. Architecture in Rome was never just functional. It was instructional. The House of the Vestals and the Temple of Vesta worked together as a kind of silent teacher, guiding movement, attention, and even thought. The Temple of Vesta itself was unlike most Roman temples. It was round, not rectangular, echoing the shape of an ancient hearth. There was no statue of the goddess inside. The flame was the presence. This absence mattered. Without a face or form to look at, the focus stayed on maintenance rather than devotion. The Vestals did not worship Vesta by praying to an image. They worshipped her by keeping something alive. This created a constant sense of responsibility. You could not step away from the hearth without feeling its pull. The open design meant light, air, and sound moved freely through the space. Smoke drifted upward, visible to anyone nearby. The city could literally see whether the fire burned. Privacy did not exist in the place that mattered most. Next to the temple stood the House of the Vestals, arranged around a central courtyard with pools and gardens. At first glance, it felt peaceful. Water reflected the sky. Plants softened the marble. Statues of former Vestals lined the space, watching silently. These statues were not decoration. They were reminders. Each face represented someone who had completed her service successfully, someone who had survived. Living quarters were orderly and restrained. Rooms were comfortable but not indulgent. Nothing invited excess or personal expression. The environment encouraged sameness. This was intentional. Individual identity was meant to fade into function. You belonged here not because of who you were, but because of what you did. Movement through the space followed predictable paths. Ritual areas, living spaces, and administrative rooms were clearly separated. This reduced chaos and reinforced routine. A Vestal learned where she could pause and where she must keep moving, where she could speak and where silence was expected. The building taught these lessons long before words did. Location mattered too. The Vestals lived at the heart of Rome, beside the Forum, surrounded by political life. They were not hidden away. They were placed deliberately where everyone could see that religion and governance were inseparable. Senators walked past the Vestals daily. Power brushed shoulders with purity. The message was constant. At the same time, walls created separation. The city was close, but never fully accessible. This balance between visibility and isolation defined Vestal life. Always seen, never fully included. Over years, this environment shaped the body and mind. Vestals moved with measured steps because space demanded it. They spoke softly because echoes carried. They internalized order because disorder stood out immediately. Architecture became discipline made solid. When the Vestal order ended, these spaces did not vanish overnight. They lingered as ruins, stripped of purpose. Without belief, the buildings became empty shells. The hearth grew cold. The courtyard fell silent. Structure remained, but meaning drained away. This reminds us that institutions are not only held together by rules and people, but by physical environments that reinforce them daily. When belief fades, even the strongest walls cannot hold purpose in place. The last generations of Vestals lived in a Rome that felt familiar on the surface but hollow underneath. The streets were still busy. The forum still echoed with voices. Temples still stood. But belief had thinned. What had once been unquestioned now felt ceremonial, repeated out of habit rather than conviction. The Vestals sensed this shift even if no one spoke it aloud. Rituals continued exactly as before. The flame was tended. The words were spoken correctly. The movements remained precise. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. Fewer people paused to watch. Fewer whispered prayers as Vestals passed. The fire still burned, but it no longer carried the same emotional weight. This created a strange kind of loneliness. Earlier Vestals carried fear like a constant shadow, but they also carried purpose. The final Vestals carried uncertainty. They were doing everything right, yet the world seemed less invested in the outcome. Anxiety no longer exploded into accusations. Instead, it drifted elsewhere toward new ideas, new beliefs, new explanations. Christianity did not replace Roman religion overnight. For a long time, the two existed side by side. Churches grew quietly while temples aged. Vestals walked past new gathering places where different prayers were spoken, prayers that did not depend on fire or ritual perfection. This was deeply unsettling, not because it was hostile, but because it was indifferent. Indifference is harder to fight than fear. State support weakened gradually. Funding slowed. Repairs were delayed. Ceremonies lost prominence. Vestals were still respected, but their presence no longer anchored public confidence. The institution existed more because it always had than because anyone knew what would happen if it ended. For Vestals trained to believe that Rome depended on them, this was destabilizing. Their entire identity rested on necessity. If the city no longer needed them, who were they? Some clung tighter to ritual, believing devotion could revive belief. Others quietly adjusted expectations, focusing inward, mentoring novices, maintaining dignity even as attention faded. No rebellion occurred. Vestals were not raised to rebel. They were raised to endure. When the official order to extinguish the sacred flame finally came, it was administrative, not dramatic. No crowd gathered. No panic spread. The fire was allowed to die because the state no longer saw value in keeping it alive. The moment passed almost unnoticed. For the Vestals present, it marked the end of certainty. Not freedom, not punishment, just an ending without explanation. Some were absorbed into other religious roles. Some faded into private life. History records little about them because endings without conflict rarely survive the page. Their silence mirrored the silence of the flame. Yet there is something quietly powerful in this final image. Women trained to hold an empire's fear watched that fear move on without them. They had done their jobs perfectly and still became unnecessary. The day began the way it always had, without urgency and without announcement. Before Rome fully woke, before carts rattled over stone and voices rose in the streets, a Vestal stirred inside the house of the Vestals. The air was cool and still. Marble held the night's chill. She rose from her bed and stood for a moment, not in prayer, not in thought, but in habit, allowing her body to remember what it had done for years. She washed her hands slowly, then her face, letting the water linger longer than needed. There was no reason to hurry anymore, though no one had said that aloud. She dressed with practiced care, smoothing the white fabric, adjusting it by touch rather than sight. The veil was placed correctly the first time, then checked again. Correctness still mattered, even if fewer eyes seemed to care. The walk to the Temple of Vesta was short, but familiar enough to feel longer. Her feet followed the same path they always had. Each step echoed faintly, a sound unchanged by time. Inside the temple, the flame waited. It always waited. She approached it calmly, leaned close enough to feel warmth, and studied its shape. The fire burned steadily. She added prepared wood in the prescribed way, pausing between movements, watching how the flame accepted it. Once, this moment carried weight beyond measure. Once, Rome's confidence rested here. Now, the flame burned faithfully, quietly, without drawing attention from the city beyond the temple walls. Smoke rose cleanly, unnoticed. When the ritual was complete, the Vestal lingered just a moment longer than required. Not in fear, not in devotion, simply in awareness. Something about the space felt different. Not emptier, just quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Back inside the house, novices moved through their training. Steps were practiced, postures adjusted. A senior Vestal corrected a shoulder with a light touch and said nothing more. Discipline remained, but the sharpness beneath it had softened. Fear no longer pressed against every instruction. What remained was structure, inherited and intact. As the morning wore on, the city's noise grew louder beyond the walls, but the house of the Vestals remained steady, enclosed, unchanged, holding a rhythm that no longer set the pace for Rome itself. By midday, the Vestals passed through the forum as they always had, robes clean, movements measured. Rome was busy, distracted, alive with other concerns. Some people noticed them and stepped aside out of habit. Others glanced briefly and continued on. A few did not look at all. The Vestals felt this absence more than open disrespect. Being ignored was unfamiliar. Being necessary had once been everything. Inside her thoughts, the same quiet loop repeated. We are doing this correctly. We have always done this correctly. The city once needed that correctness. The city now leans on other explanations. No one spoke these thoughts aloud. Saying them would have felt like failure, even if failure no longer carried punishment. So the Vestals continued. They prepared sacred materials with the same care. They reviewed records that fewer officials requested. They taught chants whose sounds remained precise, even as fewer people remembered why those sounds mattered. In the afternoon, instruction continued. A novice hesitated and was gently corrected. Another repeated a movement until it was exact. Training went on as if the world beyond the walls had not changed. Inside the order, purpose still existed because it had been shaped into every gesture. As evening approached, the flame was checked again. Fire responded the way it always had. It did not know belief. It did not know history. It burned when tended and dimmed when neglected. The Vestal watched it longer than required, not out of ritual but recognition. Something was slowly coming apart, not violently, not dramatically, but quietly. Night settled over Rome. The city's noise softened. Inside the house of the Vestals, lamps were lit and voices lowered. Another day ended without error. Another day in which the world did not collapse, not because of ritual, but because the world had learned to carry itself differently. This was not tragedy. It was endurance after necessity had faded. The Vestals continued because continuation had become identity. Even as belief loosened its grip on the city, discipline remained inside them, steady and unbroken. Morning returned without ceremony. Light crept into the house of the Vestals in thin bands, touching stone floors that had felt the same light for centuries. A Vestal woke before being summoned, as she always had. Her body responded to routine before thought had time to form. She sat up, paused, then rose, careful not to disturb the quiet that still belonged to the night. She washed again, the same motions, the same cool water. Her hands moved automatically, but her thoughts lagged behind, circling familiar ground. There had been a time when waking felt like stepping into responsibility so large it pressed on the chest. Now the feeling was flatter, not lighter, just different. Obligation remained. Consequence did not feel as sharp. She dressed and stepped outside into the courtyard. The air smelled faintly of ash and old stone. Somewhere nearby, Rome was already awake, but the sounds felt farther away than they once had. The city used to lean inward toward this place, as if drawn by gravity. Now it simply existed alongside it. At the temple, the flame still burned. It greeted her with the same warmth, the same steady glow. She tended it carefully, measuring each movement, watching how the fire responded. It behaved as it always had. Fire did not weaken because belief weakened. That realization stayed with her longer than usual. The ritual was completed without error, and yet the sense of completion felt incomplete. Later in the morning, a messenger arrived. He was polite, formal, but unhurried. His presence would once have caused immediate attention. Now he waited while the Vestals finished their tasks. When he finally spoke, his message was brief. An administrative notice. A change in oversight. Nothing urgent. Nothing ceremonial. Just a reminder that authority now flowed from elsewhere. The Vestals listened without comment. They acknowledged the message, thanked the messenger, and returned to their duties. But something subtle shifted in the space after he left. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The world was no longer asking permission. Instruction continued. A novice asked a question she might not have dared to ask years earlier. The senior Vestal answered calmly, firmly, but without the edge of warning that once followed uncertainty. Training adjusted itself quietly, the way living things do when conditions change. By midday, the Vestals walked again through public space. The forum was louder than ever. Arguments rose and fell. Laughter broke out near the shops. Politics, trade, and gossip filled the air. The Vestals passed through it like something remembered rather than required. Inside, the thought returned again, steady and unavoidable. We are still here. We are still exact. But the city is learning to live without needing us to be feared. That realization did not stop their steps. It simply followed them, as constant as the sound of sandals on stone, as persistent as the flame waiting back at the temple. As the afternoon wore on, the house of the Vestals settled into its familiar quiet. Sunlight shifted across the courtyard, marking time more reliably than any announcement. A Vestal sat with a small group of novices, reviewing tasks that had been reviewed countless times before. The words came easily, practiced into memory, yet she noticed how the girls listened differently now. Their attention was sincere, but less burdened by fear. They were learning discipline, not dread. One novice asked about the old days, about stories she had heard from her family. Had it really been true, she wondered, that the fate of Rome depended on the flame? The question was not meant as challenge. It was genuine curiosity. The Vestal answered carefully. She did not lie. She did not exaggerate. She said only that Rome once believed it did, and belief had power of its own. The novice nodded, satisfied, and returned to her work. The answer lingered longer than the question. Later, records were reviewed. Scrolls were unrolled and re-rolled, their edges worn smooth by generations of hands. Names of Vestals long gone filled the pages, each one marked by years of service, by duties completed without incident. The Vestal traced a line with her finger and wondered how many of those women had sensed change before it arrived. How many had lived their final years performing rituals whose meaning had already begun to slip. As evening approached, the city's energy shifted. Voices outside softened. The sharp sounds of commerce gave way to slower footsteps and distant conversation. Inside the temple, the flame was checked again. It burned steadily, unchanged by the quiet transformation unfolding around it. The Vestal adjusted the wood, observed the smoke, and felt the familiar heat on her face. This task still mattered to her, even if its reach no longer extended beyond these walls. When darkness settled, lamps were lit in the house of the Vestals. Supper was simple, eaten without ceremony. Conversation drifted toward ordinary things. Small repairs, weather, the health of a novice who had been coughing. Life continued in its narrow, contained way. Before sleep, the Vestal paused in the corridor and listened. Rome breathed beyond the walls, vast and unconcerned. The city was not hostile. It was simply moving forward. She realized then that the end of their role would not come with noise or outrage. It would arrive the way this day had passed, quietly, almost gently, without anyone outside noticing the moment it happened. She lay down knowing that tomorrow would begin the same way. She would rise, wash, dress, and tend the flame. Continuation was no longer about saving Rome. It was about honoring the shape of a life that had been given purpose long before she had chosen it. The next morning arrived with a heaviness that had nothing to do with weather. The sky was clear, the air mild, yet something felt settled in place before anyone moved. A Vestal woke as she always did, but this time the silence pressed closer. It was the kind of quiet that comes before an ordinary day that will later be remembered as important. She followed her routine without variation. Water over hands, water over face, fabric lifted, wrapped, adjusted. The discipline still held her body steady even as her thoughts wandered further than they once had permission to go. She noticed how often her mind now drifted toward the future, something her training had discouraged. The future had never been her concern, only continuity. As she stepped into the courtyard, she noticed officials waiting near the entrance. Not priests, not senators, administrators. Their clothing was neat but unceremonial. They stood patiently, speaking in low voices, not looking toward the temple with reverence or fear. They were waiting for a task to be completed, not for a sign. The Vestal acknowledged them with a nod and continued to the temple first. The flame still burned. It always burned. She tended it with the same care, aware that this act might soon be observed as symbolic rather than essential. The thought did not weaken her movements. If anything, it sharpened them. Precision had become a form of resistance against being reduced to memory. When she returned, the officials spoke. Their words were careful, measured, stripped of drama. Resources were being reassigned. Responsibilities clarified. The Vestals would continue their duties, but oversight now rested elsewhere. Nothing was said about failure. Nothing was said about blame. The implication was simple. The world had changed its structure, and this place had been folded into something larger and less sacred. The Vestals listened without interruption. They asked practical questions. They confirmed procedures. They accepted the information the way they accepted everything else, without outward reaction. Inside, however, the meaning shifted again. This was no longer a slow drift. This was direction. As the officials left, the house of the Vestals felt unchanged and altered at the same time. The walls stood. The routines remained. But authority had quietly stepped away from fear and ritual and into record-keeping and policy. The Vestal realized that the flame was no longer protected by belief, only by habit. Instruction continued for the novices. Tasks were assigned. Corrections were made. Life moved forward in the only way it knew how. Yet beneath every action ran the same unspoken understanding. Continuation was now conditional, not on divine favor, but on usefulness. By midday, the Vestals passed through Rome again. The city felt indifferent, not cruel. People were busy. Children ran past without stopping. The Vestals walked on, aware that they were becoming part of the background of a city that once centered itself around their presence. Inside, the thought formed clearly for the first time. We are being allowed to finish, not required to endure. The afternoon unfolded slowly, as if time itself had adjusted to the knowledge that nothing urgent remained. Inside the house of the Vestals, ordinary tasks filled the hours. Floors were swept. Offerings were sorted. Repairs that had been postponed for years were quietly approved, not because they were suddenly needed, but because there was no longer a reason to delay them. Maintenance had replaced reverence. A Vestal spent time with the records again, unrolling scrolls that listed centuries of names. She moved through them carefully, recognizing patterns she had never been encouraged to notice before. Long stretches of calm, sudden gaps marked by brief notes, occasional annotations written in a firmer hand. These were not heroic stories. They were traces of lives lived within strict limits, defined more by what was prevented than what was achieved. She paused on a familiar name, one spoken often during instruction. A Vestal remembered for perfection, for an unbroken term of service. No scandal, no punishment, just decades of quiet correctness. The Vestal reading now wondered whether that woman had felt what she felt, standing near the end of something without a clear signal that it was ending. As evening approached, the temple grew quieter. The flame burned as it always had, steady and obedient. The Vestal adjusted the wood and watched the fire respond. She had spent her life believing this act held the city together. Now she understood that the city had learned to hold itself together without noticing whether the flame burned at all. This realization did not bring anger. It brought a strange calm. Fear had once made the role sharp and heavy. Its absence left space, and in that space came reflection. She thought of the years ahead, of completing her service, of leaving a house that had shaped every movement of her body. The future felt undefined, but no longer forbidden. Night settled gently over Rome. Lamps were lit. The city's noise softened into something distant and continuous. Inside the house of the Vestals, supper was eaten quietly. Conversation was sparse but not tense. There was nothing left to argue against. Before sleep, the Vestal returned once more to the temple. The flame glowed steadily in the darkness. She stood watching it, not as a guardian of Rome, but as a witness to continuity finally reaching its limit. The fire did not know it was nearing an end. It burned because it was fed. She turned away knowing that one day soon, she would not return to this place. The ending would not arrive with collapse or outrage. It would arrive as this day had passed, through procedure, through quiet agreement, through a decision made elsewhere. The role of the Vestals was not being destroyed. It was being allowed to conclude. The following days settled into a rhythm that felt strangely gentle. Nothing was announced. No ceremony marked the change. The Vestals continued to rise early, to wash, to dress, to move through their routines with the same care they had always shown. Yet beneath every action was the awareness that they were now completing something, not sustaining it. A Vestal noticed how time behaved differently when purpose loosened its grip. Moments stretched. Small tasks took on weight they had never carried before. Folding fabric became deliberate. Walking corridors felt longer. Even silence had texture. She found herself paying attention to details she once passed without noticing. The way light caught on the edge of a column, the faint sound of ash shifting inside the brazier. At the temple, the flame still burned. It had not dimmed or faltered. It was fed as carefully as ever, tended with the same respect, but the act now felt like caretaking rather than protection. The Vestal stood longer than required, watching the fire's steady movement, committing it to memory without realizing she was doing so. Outside the temple, Rome moved on with little awareness. New laws were discussed. New leaders argued for attention. People spoke of the future with confidence, not fear. The Vestals passed through public spaces almost invisibly now, their presence acknowledged only when tradition demanded politeness. The city no longer searched their faces for reassurance. Inside the house of the Vestals, conversations shifted. Not openly, not dramatically, but gently. Questions about what came after service were asked more often. Answers were uncertain, but no longer discouraged. For the first time, life beyond the walls felt imaginable. That realization was unsettling and quietly freeing. A Vestal found herself remembering her arrival years ago, young and frightened, aware that one mistake could ruin everything. That fear had shaped her into something precise and contained. Now, without it, she wondered who she might be without constant vigilance. The thought was both frightening and strangely calm. As evening approached, the routines continued. The flame was checked again. Records were updated. Lamps were lit. Another day passed without error. Another day in which nothing visibly changed, even as everything continued to move toward conclusion. The Vestal understood now that endings do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive through repetition, through days that look identical until one of them is quietly the last. Night brought a deeper quiet than before, not emptiness, but a sense of completion that settled into the house of the Vestals like dust. The lamps burned low, their light steady and practical. A Vestal moved through the corridors one last time before rest, her steps soft, unhurried. She noticed how the building seemed to breathe with her, stone holding warmth from the day, shadows resting where they always had. She paused near the records room, listening to the faint sound of parchment shifting as air moved through the space. These scrolls had once represented power, responsibility, danger. Now they felt like memory made physical. She wondered who would read them next, and whether the names written there would mean anything beyond dates and duties. The thought did not feel bitter, felt honest. Before sleep, she returned again to the temple. The flame glowed quietly, smaller now only because the night made everything else recede. She adjusted the wood, watched the fire respond, and stood still. This was no longer an act meant to secure Rome's future. It was an act of respect for something that had shaped countless lives, including her own. In the distance, the city murmured. Rome was vast, resilient, already telling itself new stories about why it endured. The Vestal understood then that the flame had never truly protected the city on its own. People had protected it, believing they were being watched, guided, held together. Belief had done the work. The flame had simply given belief a shape. She turned away slowly, knowing she would return again tomorrow, and the day after that until she was told not to. There would be no dramatic final tending. No crowd gathered to witness the moment. The end would come quietly, folded into routine, like everything else in her life had been. As she lay down to sleep, she felt neither fear nor relief, only acceptance. Her role had not failed. It had run its course, and in that realization was a calm deeper than certainty. A calm that comes when a life shaped by duty finally understands that duty can end without losing meaning. Morning came with a thin, pale light that felt softer than before. A Vestal woke and lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet around her. The house of the Vestals was never truly silent, but this morning the sounds felt distant, almost respectful. She rose, washed, and dressed with the same care she had practiced for years. Yet each movement now carried a faint awareness that it was part of a finite sequence. In the courtyard, the air was cool. She noticed how familiar everything felt, how deeply the place had shaped her sense of order and time. The columns, the worn stone, the paths between rooms all existed inside her as much as around her. She realized that even if she left, these rhythms would remain in her body. At the temple, the flame greeted her as it always had. She tended it carefully, measuring each motion, watching how the fire responded. It burned steadily, obediently, unaware of its place in history. She wondered how many times she had stood here without thinking, and how now every moment seemed to ask for attention. The flame had become something to be remembered rather than relied upon. Later in the morning, word spread quietly among the Vestals. No announcement, no formal decree, just confirmation. The sacred fire would not be renewed indefinitely. The duties would continue for now, but an end had been acknowledged. The message passed without panic. There was no shock left to absorb it, only a shared understanding that something long expected had finally been spoken. Training continued, but its tone shifted. A senior Vestal corrected a novice gently and then paused, adding an explanation she would not once have offered. The novice listened closely, aware that she was learning something that might soon belong only to memory. Knowledge felt fragile in a new way. When the Vestals walked through Rome later that day, the city felt unchanged. People hurried, argued, laughed, planned. The knowledge carried by the Vestals existed only among themselves. The world outside had already moved beyond the need to notice. Inside, the thought formed clearly. We are no longer holding the future in place. We are preparing to let go without breaking. The afternoon moved slowly, as if time itself had been instructed to be careful. Inside the house of the Vestals, the usual tasks were completed with an added layer of attention. Bowls were cleaned and set back in place. Sacred tools were checked not for urgency, but for condition. Each object was handled as if it might soon belong to someone else, or to no one at all. A Vestal spent time with the novices, not drilling them, but talking through the reasons behind movements they had always been told simply to repeat. Why the steps were taken in a certain order. Why the flame was approached from one side and not the other. The explanations were practical, grounded, free of threat. Fear was no longer needed to preserve accuracy. Respect was enough. Later, alone for a moment, the Vestal walked through the corridors slowly. She traced her fingers along the stone where generations before her had done the same. These walls had absorbed countless footsteps, whispered corrections, restrained emotions. They had held lives shaped by silence and restraint. Letting go of the role did not mean letting go of that history. As evening approached, the flame was tended once more. The fire burned cleanly, unchanged by the quiet decision that had already been made about its future. The Vestal felt the familiar warmth on her face and realized that for the first time, she was not guarding Rome against disaster. She was witnessing the closing of a long agreement between belief and ritual. Night came gently. Supper was shared without ceremony. Conversation drifted toward ordinary memories, moments of laughter from years past, small mistakes that had once felt enormous. There was comfort in speaking freely, as if the loosening of purpose had also loosened something inside them. Before sleep, the Vestal lay still, listening to Rome beyond the walls. The city sounded confident, unafraid, carried forward by forces that no longer required sacred flames or eternal vows. She felt no bitterness toward it. Rome had grown beyond the fear that once shaped it. Tomorrow would come, and the flame would still be there. But now, everyone understood that continuity no longer meant permanence. It meant finishing well. The final stretch did not arrive with tension. It arrived with clarity. A Vestal woke before dawn and knew, without being told, that the days ahead would be counted differently. Not numbered aloud, not marked on any public record, but felt internally, the way one feels the approach of a season change before the weather fully turns. She washed and dressed as always, but her attention lingered on the smallest details. The sound of water against stone, the weight of fabric as it settled over her shoulders, the way the corridor smelled faintly of ash and oil. These sensations no longer blended into routine. They stood apart, asking to be remembered. At the temple, the flame burned steadily, unchanged by knowledge. She tended it with the same care she always had, adding fuel, adjusting placement, watching how the fire responded. The movements were exact, but her awareness was wider now. She understood that she was not maintaining eternity. She was completing a promise made long before her birth. Later, the Vestals gathered quietly. No ceremony marked the moment, but the understanding among them was complete. The fire would not be passed endlessly from day to day. When the time came, it would be allowed to end, not as punishment, not as failure, but as conclusion. The idea settled among them without resistance. They had spent their lives preserving order. This too was order. Throughout the day, tasks were completed with calm precision. Objects were cleaned, organized, accounted for. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was neglected. The house of the Vestals felt unusually balanced, as if it recognized what was coming and chose stillness over anxiety. When the Vestals moved through Rome that afternoon, the city felt vast and self-assured. People spoke of trade, of politics, of personal plans. No one looked toward the temple for signs. The world did not pause, and that finally felt right. Inside the Vestals' thoughts, the final understanding took shape. The flame had never existed to last forever. It had existed to serve a time when people needed a visible center for their fear and hope. That time had passed. As evening approached, she returned once more to the temple. The fire glowed softly in the dimming light. She stood with it in silence, not guarding it, not pleading for it, simply acknowledging it. This was what finishing looked like. Not collapse, not loss, just completion carried out with the same discipline that had sustained everything before it. Night settled gently, without ceremony, as if the city itself understood that nothing dramatic was required. The house of the Vestals held its quiet the way it always had, stone absorbing sound, corridors carrying only the soft movement of those still awake. A Vestal walked once more through the familiar paths, not out of duty this time, but out of recognition. These walls had shaped her posture, her pace, her way of thinking. Leaving them unchanged felt like respect. Inside the temple, the flame waited. It burned steadily, neither brighter nor weaker than before. There was no signal, no sign from it. Fire did not announce endings. It only responded to care. The Vestal approached slowly, feeling the warmth on her face, watching the small movements of light and shadow. She understood now that this was not a moment of loss. Nothing was being taken away. Something was being released. She did not rush. She checked the flame one final time, not to preserve it, but to acknowledge it. The tools rested where they always had. The space remained ordered, complete, whole. When she stepped back, she did so calmly, knowing that the act of stepping away carried as much meaning as the years of tending had before it. Outside, Rome continued to breathe. Voices drifted through the night. Somewhere laughter rose, then faded. The city did not know this moment was happening, and it did not need to. Rome no longer depended on a single flame to believe in its future. Carried itself forward through memory, law, habit, and human will. The Vestal returned to the house quietly. Others were already at rest. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Each woman understood that her role had been fulfilled not because it had ended, but because it had endured long enough to no longer be required. As she lay down, the Vestal felt no fear, no emptiness, only a deep stillness. Her life had been shaped by restraint, by precision, by continuity. Those qualities did not disappear with the flame. They lived on in her, and in the countless others who had learned to believe, to behave, and to hold themselves together because of what the Vestals had once represented. The sacred fire would be remembered not for how it ended, but for how long it burned, and for the lives it quietly ordered while the world learned how to stand on its own. Morning returned in a way that felt unfamiliar, even though nothing about it had changed. Light slipped into the house of the Vestals, touching stone that had witnessed centuries of beginnings. A Vestal woke and remained still longer than usual, listening. The absence she sensed was not loud. It was subtle, like a sound that had stopped so gradually it took effort to notice it was gone. She rose and followed the motions that had once defined her entire life. Water over hands, over face. Fabric lifted, wrapped, smoothed. Her body remembered the order perfectly. Habit had outlived necessity. That realization arrived without panic. It felt almost comforting. Training, once etched into muscle and bone, did not vanish just because its purpose had shifted. She stepped into the courtyard and paused. The air was cool, carrying the scent of stone and ash. Somewhere beyond the walls, Rome was awake and moving, unaware that something ancient had already passed into memory. The city sounded confident, busy with itself, no longer turning inward toward a single sacred center. Instinct carried her toward the temple before thought intervened. She stopped herself halfway, surprised by the pause. There was nothing left to tend in the way she had always understood tending. The space still existed. The order still mattered, but the task itself had changed. She adjusted her path and continued walking, allowing herself to feel the weight of that small choice. Inside the house, other Vestals moved quietly, each navigating the same internal shift. No one spoke about it directly. Words felt unnecessary. The shared experience was visible in slower steps, in glances that lingered, in the care given to simple actions. They were learning how to exist without the constant pull of a duty that had once shaped every hour. Later, records were gathered and reviewed one final time. Scrolls were checked for completeness, not because someone demanded it, but because leaving things unfinished felt wrong. The Vestal traced familiar names with her finger, aware that she was now part of that list. Another life defined by service that had ended not in failure, but in fulfillment. As the day moved on, the house of the Vestals remained steady. Nothing collapsed. Nothing rushed forward. Life continued inside its walls, quieter now, but intact. The Vestals were still here. They were still disciplined. What had changed was not who they were, but what the world required them to be. The afternoon passed with a softness that would once have felt dangerous. Inside the house of the Vestals, time no longer pressed against every movement. Tasks were completed, but without the sense that a mistake could ripple outward into disaster. A Vestal noticed how this absence of pressure changed the way she breathed, the way her shoulders rested, the way her thoughts wandered more freely than they ever had permission to before. She walked through rooms that had always felt restricted, now feeling simply quiet. The places where instructions had once been whispered or enforced now held only memory. She touched the edge of a table worn smooth by centuries of careful use and realized how much of her life had been spent preventing change rather than experiencing it. The insight arrived gently, without regret. Outside the walls, Rome continued its daily rhythm. The sounds of the city drifted in, unfiltered by fear or expectation. People argued, bargained, laughed, planned. None of it felt threatening. None of it needed correction. The city had learned to regulate itself without sacred intermediaries. As evening approached, the Vestals gathered informally. There was no ritual, no hierarchy enforced in that moment. They spoke of ordinary things, where one might go after her term ended, whether the habits of this place would ever fully leave them. There was uncertainty, but not despair. Structure had shaped them, and structure would remain inside them even without these walls. When night came, the house settled into rest. Lamps were lit, then dimmed. The familiar sounds of footsteps faded. A Vestal lay awake longer than usual, listening to the quiet. It was not the tense quiet of vigilance. It was the quiet of something completed properly. She understood then that endings do not erase what came before. They clarify it. The Vestals had not failed Rome. They had prepared it to continue without them. That was a form of success rarely acknowledged. As sleep finally came, the thought settled gently into place. The flame was gone, but the discipline, restraint, and continuity it had demanded lived on, carried forward not by ritual, but by people who had learned how to hold themselves steady when belief itself changed. Morning arrived with fewer instructions than before. A woman who had once been a Vestal woke in the same way she always had, before the city fully stirred, before sound gathered strength. For a moment, her body prepared to rise with urgency that no longer had a destination. Then she remembered. The flame no longer needed her. The house no longer required her presence in the same way. She lay still, letting that realization settle without resistance. When she did rise, her movements were slower, uncertain in small ways that surprised her. She washed and dressed, but without the rigid sequence that had once governed every motion. The absence of that structure felt both freeing and disorienting, like walking without a familiar weight. She paused more often, not because she was unsure what to do, but because nothing demanded immediacy anymore. Outside, Rome sounded unchanged. The city did not acknowledge transitions quietly endured by individuals. It continued to breathe, to argue, to plan, to rebuild itself endlessly. She stepped into the street aware that for the first time in years, she was simply another woman moving through public space. No deference followed her steps. No one lowered their voice. No one searched her expression for signs of reassurance. This invisibility was not cruel, but it was abrupt. She had spent her life being noticed without being known. Now she was unknown without being noticed. The shift required adjustment that training had never prepared her for. As she walked, she caught herself standing straighter than others, moving with an economy shaped by years of correction. Habit marked her even when role did not. She wondered whether those habits would ever loosen, or whether they would remain long after the reason for them had faded. Later in the day, she sat alone for a while watching people pass. Merchants negotiated. Children ran past without caution. Women spoke openly, their voices unmeasured by fear of consequence. She listened without judgment. The world she had once helped stabilize had learned to live without needing her restraint. Inside, a new loop formed, quieter than the ones she had known before. If my duty is complete, who am I when no one is watching? The question did not demand an answer yet. It simply existed, waiting, the way the flame once had, patient and unresolved. As the day moved forward without instruction, the afternoon unfolded without structure, and that was what made it difficult. Time no longer arrived divided into assigned tasks or guarded intervals. A former Vestal found herself measuring the day by shadows instead of duties, by hunger instead of bells. She realized how much of her sense of self had been borrowed from schedule, how little space had ever existed for choice. She walked through parts of Rome she had rarely noticed before, narrow streets where vendors shouted freely, courtyards where women gathered without lowering their voices, homes where laughter carried without restraint. No one looked twice at her. No one knew she had once lived inside a sacred boundary. The city had already absorbed her absence. At one point, she paused near a shrine tended by ordinary hands. The offerings were simple, imperfect. The flame there flickered unevenly. No one corrected it. No one feared it. People passed, nodded, and continued on. Belief still existed, but it had loosened its grip, no longer demanding perfection to function. She sat nearby and watched for a long time. The instinct to intervene rose and faded. This was not her role anymore. Letting that instinct go felt like learning to unclench a muscle that had been tight for decades. It ached slightly as it relaxed. As evening approached, she considered returning to the house of the Vestals out of habit, then stopped herself. That place still existed, but it no longer defined her movement. Instead, she followed the flow of the city until it carried her somewhere unfamiliar. The uncertainty did not frighten her. It required attention, not obedience. When night fell, she found a quiet place to rest. The city sounded different when it was no longer something she served. Felt larger, less intimate, but also less heavy. She lay listening to it, aware that tomorrow would not tell her who to be. She would have to discover that herself, slowly, without ritual, without consequence. For the first time in her life, continuation was not enforced. It was chosen. The next morning arrived without the familiar pull toward precision. The former Vestal woke later than she ever had before, surprised not by the light in the room, but by the absence of urgency in her body. No internal signal demanded she rise immediately. No mistake waited to be avoided. She lay still, listening to the ordinary sounds of the city beginning its day, realizing how rarely she had simply listened without preparing to act. When she finally rose, she dressed without ceremony. The movements were still careful, still economical, but no longer enforced by fear. She noticed how her hands hesitated when choosing clothing, how unfamiliar choice felt. Inside the house of the Vestals, garments had never been selected, only worn. Here, even this small decision carried weight. She stepped outside and walked with no destination in mind. The city felt different when she was not moving between assigned spaces. Streets opened into one another unpredictably. People crossed her path without adjusting their pace. She felt neither honored nor threatened, only present. This ordinary presence was something she had never been trained to manage. As the day unfolded, she observed herself reacting to small disruptions. A sudden shout made her tense. A careless gesture unsettled her. Years of discipline had sharpened her awareness, but without a role to direct it, that awareness searched for purpose. She wondered whether it would soften over time or remain permanently alert, like a flame with nothing left to guard. By midday, she sat among others in a public space, unnoticed. Conversations flowed freely around her. Complaints, jokes, plans for the evening. None of it required her attention. None of it asked for her restraint. She realized how often her silence had once been interpreted as authority. Now it was simply silence. Inside, a quiet understanding formed. Life outside ritual did not rush to fill the space left behind. It moved on its own terms. Adjusting to that pace would take time. The discipline that had once defined her would need to become something internal, something chosen rather than enforced, if it was to survive at all. The afternoon brought with it a gentle fatigue that surprised her. Not the exhaustion that followed constant vigilance, but the kind that came from deciding for oneself how to spend a day. Choice required attention. Without the structure that had once carried her forward automatically, each hour felt heavier, more deliberate, as if time itself now asked something of her. She found a shaded place to sit and watched the city move. People passed with confidence, guided by needs she had never been allowed to acknowledge openly. Work, family, desire, worry. These forces shaped their days without ritual or supervision. She wondered how many years it would take before such motivations felt natural to her rather than unfamiliar and faintly improper. As she rested, memories surfaced without warning. The first day she had entered the house of the Vestals, the strict correction of posture, the silence that had once felt like safety. Those memories no longer carried fear, but they still carried weight. They had built her discipline piece by piece. Letting them exist without ruling her present felt like another skill she would have to learn. Later, she rose and walked again, slower now, less certain, but no longer tense. The city did not resist her pace. It absorbed it. She noticed how little anyone cared whether she moved with precision or not. The realization was freeing and unsettling at the same time. Perfection had once been a shield. Without it, she was simply human. As evening approached, hunger reminded her of herself in a way ritual never had. She ate simply, without ceremony, among people who did not know her past. The meal was unremarkable, and that ordinariness stayed with her. A life did not need to be sacred to be complete. When night fell, she returned to her place of rest and lay listening to the city. Tomorrow would not demand perfection. It would not punish error. It would offer only opportunity and consequence, unmarked by sacred rule. She understood then that freedom was not immediate relief. It was a slow adjustment, a gradual reshaping of discipline into something personal. The flame was gone, but the steadiness it had taught her remained, waiting to be used in a world that no longer required her to stand apart from it. Days began to stack on one another, not sharply, but gently, like thin sheets of parchment laid down without being pressed. The former Vestal woke each morning now with less surprise and more curiosity. The city no longer felt foreign, but it still did not feel fully hers. She was learning its rhythms the way a child learns language, through listening first, speaking later. She noticed how people marked time differently, not by bells or duties, but by meals, meetings, fatigue. Morning was defined by movement, afternoon by heat and noise, evening by a gradual loosening of pace. Without ritual dividing the day, she sometimes lost track of hours, and that loss unsettled her more than she expected. Structure had once protected her from uncertainty. Now she had to build her own. As she moved through Rome, she became aware of subtle reactions to her presence. Some people sensed discipline in the way she stood, in the way she waited without fidgeting. A few looked twice, not with reverence, but with curiosity. Others ignored her entirely. She realized that respect no longer came automatically. It had to be earned, negotiated, or accepted as unnecessary. One afternoon, she was asked a simple question by someone who had noticed her reserve. Where had she learned to be so composed? The question caught her off guard. For years, no one had asked her about herself. She answered briefly, carefully, offering no titles, no explanations. The response felt incomplete, but also safe. She was not ready to define herself yet. At times, instinct pulled her toward restraint when none was required. She corrected herself for small mistakes no one else noticed. She felt tension rise at disorder that others accepted easily. These reactions did not disappear quickly. Discipline, once internalized, does not leave just because its purpose changes. It lingers, waiting to be redirected. As evening approached on one such day, she watched the city settle into itself. Lamps were lit, voices softened. The sense of danger she had once associated with disorder did not arrive. Nothing collapsed. The world did not punish imperfection. This realization returned again and again, slowly loosening something inside her. She understood that adapting to ordinary life was not about forgetting who she had been. It was about deciding which parts of that life were still useful. The rest could be set down without guilt. That decision would take time, patience, and repetition, much like tending a flame once had. The story is still moving forward, just quietly, carried now by the small changes that shape a life after purpose has shifted. The next days followed a similar pattern, and within that sameness she began to notice change. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that settles into behavior without asking permission. She walked with slightly less stiffness. She paused less often to measure her actions. The city no longer felt like something she had to study carefully before touching. It felt more like a current she was slowly learning to move with. She found small ways to anchor herself, returning to the same places, sitting at the same hour, watching the same stretch of street as people passed. These were not rituals in the old sense, but they created familiarity, and familiarity eased the quiet tension that still lived in her body. Structure, she realized, did not need sanctity to be stabilizing. Occasionally, someone recognized her past. A look lingered. A question formed but was not always asked. When it came without fear, only curiosity. "Were you really one of them?" she was asked once softly. She answered simply that she had served. Nothing more. The exchange ended without ceremony. Respect did not vanish, but it no longer demanded distance. She noticed how differently people carried themselves, how freely they complained, how casually they broke rules that were never written down. At first, this unsettled her. Disorder had once meant danger. Now it meant personality. She watched arguments dissolve without consequence, mistakes corrected without punishment. The world absorbed imperfection and continued. In quiet moments, memory still surfaced. The sound of sandals echoing in marble halls, the weight of silence during ritual, the constant awareness of consequence. These memories no longer frightened her, but they still shaped her reactions. She understood now that discipline was not something to discard. It was something to soften, to allow room around. As night fell, she reflected on how little the city required from her now. No one depended on her restraint. No one watched her movements for signs. The responsibility that had once defined her was gone, and in its absence, she felt something unexpected. Relief did not arrive all at once. Instead, a gradual lightness replaced the constant vigilance she had carried for years. She realized that adaptation was not about becoming someone new. It was about allowing herself to become less guarded. The flame had taught her steadiness. The world beyond the temple was teaching her flexibility. Between those two lessons, a different kind of balance was beginning to form. Time continued to pass in a way that no longer felt threatening. Days followed one another without ceremony, and within that quiet repetition, the former Vestal began to notice a deeper shift taking place. It was not dramatic, and it did not arrive with clear moments she could point to later. Instead, it revealed itself through absence. The absence of constant tension, the absence of fear tied to small errors, the absence of the sense that the world was always on the edge of collapse if she failed to hold herself perfectly. She began to sleep more deeply. At first, this unsettled her. For years, even rest had carried alertness, a readiness to wake if something went wrong. Now, her body allowed itself to let go. When she woke, there was no jolt of panic, no instinctive check of time or responsibility. Morning simply arrived, and she met it without bracing herself. As she moved through Rome, she found that her presence settled differently among people. Some sensed her composure and responded with quiet respect. Others treated her no differently than anyone else. Both reactions felt acceptable now. She no longer needed to be set apart to feel secure. Being ordinary did not diminish her. It widened her world. She began to participate in small exchanges she once would have avoided. Brief conversations, shared observations about the day, simple agreements and disagreements that carried no lasting consequence. Each interaction loosened something inside her. The world proved again and again that it could handle variation. Stability did not require silence or restraint at every turn. At times, she still felt the pull of old instincts. When voices rose in argument, her body tightened. When plans shifted unexpectedly, irritation surfaced before she could stop it. But these reactions passed more quickly now. She observed them rather than obeying them. Discipline had become awareness rather than control. One afternoon, she was asked to help with a task that required patience and care. Nothing sacred, nothing symbolic, just steady hands and attention. As she worked, she felt something familiar settle into place. Purpose did not have to be monumental to be real. The satisfaction she felt was quieter than anything she had known before, but it lasted longer. She realized then that her training had not been wasted. It had simply been misnamed. What she had learned was not how to protect Rome through ritual, but how to move through the world with steadiness. That skill remained valuable, even without a sacred frame around it. As evening came, she walked through streets lit by lamps that flickered unevenly. No one corrected them. No one feared what their movement might mean. People adjusted as needed, relit what went out, and continued on. The simplicity of it stayed with her. Life did not demand perfection to continue. It required attention, response, and care. Lying down that night, she understood that the hardest part of her transition was not losing status or certainty. It was learning to trust a world that no longer demanded her constant restraint. That trust was growing slowly, shaped by ordinary days and unremarkable choices. She had once believed that meaning came from standing apart, from carrying weight few others could bear. Now she was learning that meaning could also come from standing within, sharing space, and allowing life to be imperfect without falling apart. The story was no longer about what had ended. It was about what remained, and how a life shaped by discipline could continue, quietly, in a world that no longer required it to be sacred. Seasons shifted almost without her noticing. The heat of summer settled into the stone of the city, then eased, then gave way to cooler mornings. The former Vestal realized one day that she no longer measured time by memory of ritual or duty, but by changes in light and air, by the way the city breathed differently as months passed. This realization did not alarm her. It felt like proof that she was finally inhabiting the same time as everyone else. Her days developed a quiet shape. She rose, moved through the city, rested, returned. Nothing sacred framed these movements, yet they began to feel grounded. She learned where shade gathered in the afternoon, which streets stayed loud even at night, which corners of the city allowed thought to wander without interruption. These patterns were not assigned. She chose them, and choice slowly became less tiring. People who knew her only as she was now accepted her easily. They knew her for her steadiness, her patience, her tendency to listen before speaking. A few learned fragments of her past, offered without drama. The story no longer shocked anyone. It was simply something that had happened, part of a Rome that was already becoming history even as it continued to exist. At times, she noticed how differently memory behaved now. The house of the Vestals no longer felt close, but it also did not feel distant. It existed in her as a complete chapter, neither aching nor demanding return. The flame appeared in her thoughts occasionally, not as obligation, but as image. A steady light that had once defined her days, now resting quietly among other memories. She discovered that discipline could become generosity, waiting without impatience, acting without needing acknowledgement, finishing tasks carefully even when no one checked her work. These habits, once enforced by fear, now emerged as choice. They no longer separated her from others. They supported her place among them. One evening, as she watched people gather for simple reasons, to eat, to talk, to pass time together, she felt a shift that surprised her. She did not feel lesser for having left something behind. She felt complete for having carried it long enough. The role had ended, but it had not emptied her. She understood then that Rome had not outgrown the Vestals by rejecting them. It had outgrown the fear that required them. What remained was the quieter inheritance, the way restraint, order, and continuity had been absorbed into daily life, spread thin enough to be unnoticed. As night settled, the city continued without concern for what had once held it together. She lay listening to the familiar sounds, no longer measuring them for signs, no longer standing guard against collapse. The world did not need watching. It needed living. And so the story moved forward, not toward another ending, but into continuation of a different kind. A life shaped by sacred discipline, now unfolding in ordinary time, steady and unremarkable, which she finally understood was not a loss, but a lasting form of peace. Years passed in a way she would once have found unsettling. They did not announce themselves. They did not arrive marked by ceremony or danger. They accumulated quietly, like dust on stone that no one bothers to wipe away because it harms nothing. The former Vestal grew older without noticing the exact moment when youth slipped into something steadier and slower. Her body changed first, then her sense of time followed. She became known in small, ordinary ways, not as a symbol, not as a reminder of Rome's past, but as a person who could be relied upon. When patience was required, she was asked. When something needed to be completed carefully, her name came up. No one spoke of sacred duty. No one feared consequence if she failed. Trust replaced reverence, and she discovered that trust felt lighter to carry. Rome continued to transform around her. New buildings rose where old ones had stood. Customs shifted. Stories about the Vestals changed in the telling. What had once been understood as fear-driven necessity became, in the mouths of younger generations, something distant and almost mythical. People spoke of the sacred fire as if it belonged to legend rather than lived experience. She listened without correcting them. At times, she felt the strange sensation of having lived inside a story that no longer existed in its original form. The Vestals were becoming history, then memory, then something softer and less precise. This did not trouble her as much as she once thought it would. She understood now that accuracy fades before meaning does. What remained mattered more than what was lost. Her discipline matured into discernment. She no longer reacted automatically. She chose when to act and when to let things pass. This choice, once unimaginable, now felt natural. The vigilance that had shaped her early life had loosened into awareness without tension. Occasionally, she encountered someone who recognized her past more clearly. A scholar, an older citizen, someone who remembered when the flame still burned. These moments were rare and quiet. They spoke briefly without spectacle. The exchange ended without ceremony. Memory was shared, then allowed to rest. She realized then that her life had become something the Vestals themselves had never planned for. Not protection, not sacrifice, but continuity in another form. She carried forward the steadiness of an old institution into a world that no longer named it as such. As she walked through Rome one evening, watching lamps flicker and voices rise and fall without fear, she felt no urge to explain what had once been necessary. The city had learned its own balance. Her place within it was no longer defined by separation, but by presence. The story of the Vestals was no longer unfolding through ritual or flame. It was unfolding through people who had absorbed its lessons and moved on. She was one of them, and that knowledge settled into her life quietly, without demand, without regret, as time continued to pass. Age arrived gradually, announced more by reflection than by weakness. The former Vestal noticed it first in the way she paused before rising, in the way her thoughts lingered longer on memories than plans. Her body still carried her steadily through the city, but she moved with a patience that had deepened rather than slowed. Time, once something guarded carefully, had become something she allowed to unfold. Rome no longer resembled the city of her youth. Streets had been widened or narrowed, buildings repaired, replaced, renamed. People spoke differently now, with fewer references to old rituals and more to personal ambitions. The sacred past existed mostly in fragments, invoked in conversation the way one might mention a distant ancestor. She listened to these references without correcting them. Accuracy no longer felt necessary. Meaning had already found its own shape. Younger people sometimes asked her about discipline, not knowing its origin. How did she remain so composed? How did she finish what she began? She answered in simple terms. Pay attention. Move slowly when it matters. Let small things be done well. These lessons no longer belonged to the Vestals alone. They had become ordinary wisdom, passed quietly from one person to another. At times, she reflected on the fear that had once governed her life. It seemed almost unreal now, like a story told about someone else. She understood, with distance, that fear had been both a tool and a burden. It had held order in place when belief was fragile. When belief strengthened, fear became unnecessary. Rome had grown, so had she. She visited the old temple grounds occasionally, not out of longing, but out of respect. The space felt different without the flame, open and still. She stood there briefly, then moved on. The past did not pull at her. It rested behind her, complete. As evening settled one day, she watched the city from a familiar spot. Lamps flickered, people adjusted them casually, unafraid of imperfection. Life continued in a way that no longer required constant vigilance. She felt a quiet satisfaction in this. The world had learned to carry itself. Her life, shaped by restraint and continuity, had not been wasted. It had simply been absorbed into a larger story, one that no longer needed to be guarded by ritual. As she walked home slowly, she understood that this absorption was the true legacy of the Vestals. Not the flame, not the fear, but the steadiness that remained long after both were gone. The story was nearing its end now, not with closure imposed from outside, but with a sense of completeness earned through time, memory, and change. The years that followed settled into something calm and unremarkable, and that was precisely what gave them weight. The former Vestal no longer thought of herself as someone transitioning from another life. The transition had finished without a clear moment of completion. What remained was simply living, shaped quietly by everything that had come before. Her days were smaller now, narrower in movement but broader in reflection. She spent more time sitting than walking, more time listening than speaking. People came to her less for answers and more for steadiness. She did not correct them when they spoke imperfectly about the past. She understood that memory reshapes itself to fit what each generation needs, not what history insists upon. Rome itself had softened, not weaker, but less anxious. The city no longer told stories about survival with the same urgency. It spoke instead about continuity, about rebuilding, about adapting. The sacred fire was mentioned rarely, often with a kind of gentle nostalgia, as if it had belonged to a childhood the city had outgrown. She listened to these conversations without attachment. The flame had served its time, so had she. Sometimes, in quiet moments, She examined her own habits with curiosity. The way she folded cloth, the way she waited before speaking, the way she accepted uncertainty without panic. These traits no longer felt imposed. They felt chosen. The discipline that had once defined her identity had softened into character. She noticed, too, how little she needed to explain herself. Her past did not demand defense or celebration. It existed as one layer among many, no heavier than any other. This realization brought a subtle freedom she had not expected. When nothing needs to be justified, life becomes lighter. In the evenings, she often watched the city settle. Lamps lit unevenly, doors closed at different hours, voices rose and fell without pattern. The lack of uniformity no longer troubled her. She had learned that order does not require sameness. It requires resilience. She understood then that the Vestals had not disappeared. They had dissolved into the fabric of the city, into habits and values that no longer needed a name. The institution ended, but the way it shaped people did not. That shaping lived on quietly, unrecognized, and therefore enduring. As she rested, aware that her own time was shortening without fear, she felt a deep sense of alignment. Her life had begun in constraint, moved through responsibility, and ended in quiet belonging. Nothing had been wasted. Nothing had been taken too soon. The story was preparing to close not with an event, but with understanding. The kind that only arrives when a life has been allowed to unfold fully, without urgency, without resistance, and without the need to be remembered loudly. Age did not announce itself with loss so much as with narrowing. The former Vestal noticed how her world had grown smaller in distance but deeper in texture. She no longer crossed the city often. Instead, she inhabited a few familiar paths, a handful of rooms, a narrow stretch of street where light fell the same way each afternoon. Within these limits, her attention expanded. Small things carried weight they never had before. She remembered less in sequences and more in impressions. The sound of water against stone returned without its setting. The warmth of fire appeared without flame. Discipline lived on as posture, as patience, as the instinct to finish what had been started. These fragments did not demand explanation. They were simply present, woven into her sense of self. People treated her with a gentle respect that had nothing to do with her past role. Came from observation. She listened carefully. She spoke without urgency. She did not hurry others. In a city that had learned to move quickly, this slowness stood out. It drew people in without asking for attention. Rome itself continued its long habit of forgetting details while preserving outcomes. The Vestals were now spoken of rarely, and when they were, it was as something ancient and faintly symbolic. Few remembered the fear. Fewer still remembered the women themselves. This did not trouble her. Being remembered precisely had never been the goal. Stability had been. On quiet evenings, she sometimes reflected on the idea of ending. Not the end of an institution which she had already witnessed, but the end of a life shaped by restraint. She felt no urgency to mark it. Life, she understood now, did not need punctuation. It needed coherence. Hers felt coherent. She sat often near a window or doorway, watching ordinary life pass. Children argued and reconciled. Neighbors carried on familiar disputes. Lamps were lit without ceremony and extinguished without concern. The city no longer looked fragile to her. It looked practiced. She understood then that what had once been called sacred had simply been concentrated attention. When that attention spread outward into daily life, the need for guardians disappeared. The Vestals had not failed Rome. They had taught it how to move on. As night settled, she rested without fear of what might be undone in her absence. Nothing depended on her vigilance anymore. The steadiness she carried had already been given away, distributed quietly over time. The story was nearly complete, not because everything had been said, but because nothing essential remained unresolved. The flame had gone out. The fear had faded. What endured was balance, learned slowly, lived quietly, and passed on without a name. The final years arrived without drama, and that felt appropriate. The former Vestal no longer counted time in seasons or events. She sensed it instead in the way mornings took longer to gather strength, in the way memories surfaced without effort and then drifted away again. Her body asked for rest more often, and she gave it freely without guilt or resistance. She spent long stretches simply observing. From her place near the street, she watched Rome continue its endless adjustment. Faces changed, voices changed, customs shifted almost invisibly. What once would have unsettled her now felt expected. Change had become the most reliable thing about the city. Stability no longer meant holding things still. It meant allowing movement without collapse. Occasionally, someone would sit with her and ask about the past. Not formally, not with reverence, but with the gentle curiosity people bring to things they know they will never experience directly. She answered simply, without embellishment. She spoke of routine more than ritual, of discipline more than fear. The listeners often seemed surprised by this. They had expected mystery. She offered normality. After such conversations, she felt no need to ensure she had been understood. Meaning no longer depended on transmission. What mattered had already taken root elsewhere, carried forward in habits she recognized but did not claim. Her thoughts turned less often toward what had been lost and more toward what had been absorbed. The flame existed now only as sensation, as warmth remembered without urgency. The temple appeared as a place of order rather than power. These memories felt complete. They no longer pulled her backward. As evening settled one day, she listened to the city with a kind of fond detachment. Rome sounded confident, practiced, unafraid of its own disorder. It did not look for signs. It did not wait for permission. It moved because movement had become natural. She understood then that her life had mirrored the path of the institution she had served. Both had begun in fear, matured in control, and ended in quiet release. Neither ending had been a failure. Both had been necessary. When she lay down that night, she did not think of legacy or remembrance. She thought, instead of continuity, of how one form gives way to another without breaking the larger pattern. Her breathing slowed. The city continued. The story did not close with her final breath, because stories like this do not belong to a single life. They end when balance is restored and fear no longer drives behavior. That balance had been reached.